This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're very fortunate tonight to have as our guest one of my favorite people in Alabama government. I'm going to say public service rather than politics, and is Twinkle Cavanaugh, who's a very popular young lady here in the state and has been around state politics, especially Republican politics, for decades now, even though she's still a young lady. But she's one of the good people in state government. She's president of the Public Service Commission, which is a good name for her title that she's in, because she really is a public service. Twinkle, good to have you on here.
Thank you, Steve. It's a joy to be with you again.
I love that smile. Twinkle's got $1 million smile. She's a sweet lady besides being a good government official. Twinkle, I want to start, if you will. I know we've done this over the years. You've been on the show for years. But let's start back with your childhood and go through how many things you've been involved in, if you don't mind. I know our viewers, you know, they may forget, and of course we're on YouTube now, so it goes all over the state, but when you grew up here in Montgomery, didn't you?
I did. My parents were from South Alabama. My daddy
Pike County.
That's right. My mom is from the Pike-Bullock County line, and my dad was from Crenshaw County. They shopped in Greenville, but he was from Crenshaw County. And both of my parents were math majors. They both got a degree at Troy University. Back then, Troy State.
Did they meet there?
They did. They were in a math drop and add line. For those folks who've had to drop a class and add a class, back in those days, it wasn't computerized. So you stood in line for hours, and they got to know one another.
Doing that?
And for a math class, and they were both math majors. They then went to Auburn and both got their masters in math.
Finished at Auburn.
And finished at Auburn. So anyway, they're both from South Alabama, but to get a job teaching mathematics, both of them at the same time, they moved to Montgomery, and that's where I was born. And St. Margaret's Hospital downtown.
Old St. Margaret's.
In fact, now I think
right around the corner
a
here.
state office building. Anyway, Montgomery, even though it's a very political town, when I was growing up, we didn't really have anything to do with politics, and I really didn't know anybody in politics. But I did go to nursery school on Perry Street. And
the governor's office.
that's where the governor's mansion is, yes. And my daddy would take me to nursery school in the mornings, and you know, Steve, we didn't have car seats and seat belts, and so I would stand up in his front seat of the cab of the truck, and I'd put my arm around him and hold on, and he'd take me down to Perry Street.
Were you an only child?
No, I had a younger brother, but at the time I was an only child, and he'd take me to nursery school, drop me off. That would have been Lurleen. And so anyway.
She never was out there, you know.
Right. And so, but having said that, I would always ask my daddy, who lives in that big house? Because we lived in a
that's the governor's mansion.
Little house with one bathroom, so a house like that was pretty big.
He said, that's the governor's mansion.
He'd say that, and I'd say, well, Daddy, I want to live there, and he'd laugh and say, well, one day maybe you'll marry the governor, and I'd always laugh and tell him, no, I want to live there. So, I'm
glad you did that. You were even of a generation that people thought that the women could not be governor. But we had a female governor.
We had one, but we all know why Lurleen was in the office. But bless her heart, she was only there for 2 years, as you know.
Do you know, we grew up the same way. I grew up in Troy, and everybody in Troy would come up here to Montgomery to shop. You know, to go to the doctor.
Loveman's.
With
Santa Claus in the window.
They had an escalator out there at Eastdale Mall, or wherever that was out there where, I forget. Loveman's was, yeah. And that was a big thing for us in Troy, little boys in Troy, to come up here and go shopping. But I remember Mama was driving down Perry Street where you're talking about. My first impression was, I promise you this, you hear stories about how uninhibited Big Jim Folsom was, but he was governor. And this is my first impression of a governor. We're riding down Perry Street, and out in the front yard with one of these old men T-shirts. He was sitting there with a T-shirt waving at people as they passed by. I said, Mama, who's that old man out there? That's Governor Folsom. That's your governor.
That's great.
That was my first impression. When you were talking about Perry Street, I got to thinking about Big Jim was my first cousin.
Well, you know, we were talking about Lovemans, and recently I was doing some research on the city of Montgomery and what was going on in the past, and that was always a big thing, going to Lovemans with the escalator and Santa Claus in the window. But,
even when you were growing up, it was a big thing.
I was talking to my dad, and my dad said that his big memory was coming back from Norville or Highland Home, and Miss Alabama was at, no, excuse me, wasn't Miss Alabama, Miss America came to the grand opening in 1955 of Lovemans, or from Normandale.
Yeah, and, that's where it was, Normandale.
He said his 4 friends that were with him dared him to go up and touch her. And he said, I touched Miss America. And so my dad said whenever he thinks of that shopping center, he still thinks of touching in 1955, just barely touching her.
I remember that escalator. It was a big thing for us little boys from Troy
to
see that escalator out at Lovemans.
Well, that was a big deal to us, yes.
Even being in Montgomery.
That's right.
So then you went on and you graduated from Jeff Davis High School?
I did. At the time, you know, Steve, it was the largest high school in the state of Alabama. There were only 3 grades. It was 10th through 12th back then. And
it was the biggest in the state?
Biggest in the state. You got it.
They needed another high school. When I was growing up, Lee and Lanier dominated state sports so much. I think Montgomery was a big sports town, but they were bigger too, probably.
Well,
they needed a third
when I
high
was
school.
there, Jeff Davis dominated state football, as you can remember.
Oh, yeah.
And I graduated from high school in '84, and it was a big year. For Troy fans, Mike Turk was our quarterback and went on to coach, you know, there at Troy.
He was a good guy.
Yes.
Twinkle, then you went to, where did you go to undergraduate school? I forget.
I went to Auburn.
That's right, yeah.
And loved every minute of it. War Eagle.
You hoping Ann Welch goes there, aren't you?
I sure do. My daughter's mighty special, and she's a senior this year.
Yeah, I watched her grow up, and I was talking to Jeff, your husband, recently, and he was talking about that. Of course, she goes to Montgomery Academy, which is an excellent school, by the way. Everybody knows that. But those schools are so academically strong, they encourage those kids to go out of state, to Duke and Harvard and things like that. And he said that she's looking at TCU and, besides Auburn, she's looking at TCU and some other school.
Well, let me just say, her mom and daddy are looking at Auburn. And we even said, you can look at Alabama, but we sure want Auburn. We're pulling for Auburn.
Well, I think maybe she will. Maybe a lot of her friends will. But
today, my mother lives very close to us now. And she loves to stop by her Mimi's house. And so we think that might have a little bit of an influence on her not leaving and going too far away, because she loves to stop by her Mimi's house.
She's so petite, the Ann Wilkes is.
She is.
She's not about 5'2" or something.
She's small, and she's a cheerleader and loves it.
I knew she was a cheerleader.
Has a great time in schools. She loves to be academically challenged.
Jeff said that y'all go to all the games out of town and everything. Away games.
For the high school football, you got it. And
you
know, the team is just doing fantastic this year, and it's exciting because our quarterback is a freshman, a 9th grader, and a lot of our players this year are much younger, so I can't imagine how good the team's going to be in 2 or 3 years, because they're already just superstars.
Twinkle, you know, I'll tell you something. Maybe shouldn't say this on the air, brag about a private school, but Montgomery Academy really is a strong academic school. The reason I know that is because I remember when Katie Britt was coming home. She was Senator Shelby's chief of staff, and they were giving a party for her, going away party for her to come back home to Montgomery and be the head of the BCA. And prior to that, she and Wesley had lived here, and both were lobbying, I think, or something. And then she went back to be Shelby's chief of staff. And I was walking down the hall with her, several of us, some like Joe Perkins and Joe Fine and Bob Getty were the ones who'd gone up there to say, Shelby asked us to come up there for her going away. But I said, I was walking in the hall with Katie. I said, Katie, are your children, where are you going to put your children? What grade are they in now? And she said, they're in this grade, or 3rd or 4th or whatever they were in, Ridgeway. And I said, well, what are they doing up here? She says, Steve, we bit the bullet and put them in the most expensive private school in Washington. And of course, they're going back to Montgomery Academy. She says, now, when we got in that school, we had a parent, had a conference with the people at that school. You know, it's the most elite private school in Washington. You can imagine who went there. And she says, where have your children been going to school? She said, Montgomery Academy in Montgomery, Alabama. She said, they're about 2 years ahead of everybody else in the school.
Wow, that's fantastic.
It tells a lot about Montgomery Academy. She says, so I'm glad to get them back to Montgomery Academy.
It's a very academic, challenging
school,
I can tell you. I'm up late many nights because I just don't want to go to bed until she.
Well, they're ready for college. I'm going to tell you that much, and every college wants them.
Yes.
But I didn't mean to get off that. Now, your first political experience was in Washington, wasn't it, with Sonny Callahan?
It was. Well, I worked for the Republican National Committee.
That's right. You weren't about 25 years old, even that old, were you?
Oh, goodness, I wasn't quite that old.
You just got out of Auburn.
Well, I taught school for
here
1 year here in Montgomery.
Yeah.
And teachers get paid, all year, even though you're not teaching in the summer. And so I used that money to go to Washington, and then I worked for the Republican National Committee. And after that, and the later on, the governor.
You're still in your mid-20s.
Oh, yes, early 20s.
Yeah.
And the governor of, later on would be the governor of Mississippi. Haley Barbour was chairman.
Yeah.
And then after that, worked for Sonny Callahan from Alabama, from the Mobile district.
So you were close friends with Joe Bonner from years.
Absolutely. He's a wonderful man.
He's one of the finest guys I know.
And Joe, the thing I love about Joe is that he is, and I should say President Bonner now, President Bonner has always been a man of the people. He is a public servant. He's not a politician.
He really is.
And he loves people. And it didn't matter, no matter who you were from any walk of life, if you called on him in that office, he would embrace you and do everything he could to help you.
I know.
And I've always thought I want to be more like
Joe Bonner.
Joe Bonner, because he was just such a great role model in loving people.
He was.
Loving people.
So he mentored you early on.
He certainly did. He certainly did. And I think he's doing a phenomenal job at South Alabama.
He is. Their enrollment's increased from
Well, you know what? If I were going back to school, I'd want to go where Joe Bonner was the president. So I think it's a great school.
Talking about that, he has gotten out and gets on a bus like 5 o'clock in the morning and goes and recruits kids all over that fast-growing Baldwin County area, one-on-one.
He also gets on a golf cart and drives all around the campus and gets to know the students on a first-name basis. To me, that's phenomenal.
It really is.
But now, you know what? I also love Auburn University's president. We've got a great president at Auburn now. I tell you, schools are just doing great now.
They are. Now, so you went from working for the National Republican Committee, Congressman Callahan's office, Joe Bonner, and then you, at what point, what was your next venture after Callahan's office?
I moved back to Alabama.
Were you even 30 at that time?
And just barely. And I moved back to Alabama.
So most of your 20s were in Washington.
Yes, they were. But I will tell you, Steve, my claim to fame, I have to be a little self-deprecating here, is that I created both our governor and our lieutenant governor here in Alabama. Did you know that?
What do you mean?
Well, I knew you didn't know that. Well, Kay Ivy's first success in politics was when she beat me for state treasurer.
What year was that?
2002.
Did you come home and run for treasurer in 2002?
Well, no. Before that, I was the executive director of the Republican Party.
I remember, that's what you want to do.
I worked for a national group in Alabama as a state director of a group that was fighting for tax cuts in Washington. And at the time, Bud Kramer, the congressman that was a Democrat from up in Huntsville, actually voted with the Bush tax cuts after we really campaigned in the Huntsville area hard, and we got those Bush tax cuts. And then I ran for treasurer, and Kay Ivy beat me.
In 2002.
In 2002. Now, you hadn't asked, how did I create the lieutenant governor? Well, he beat me, too, when I ran for lieutenant governor.
That's right.
And that was his first statewide endeavor. So the governor, I bet I'm the only person that can say that, but I created the governor and the lieutenant governor. How's that?
But now that's one of two races you've lost, though. How many times have you been elected to the Public Service Commission?
I was elected president in 2012.
So how many times is that? That's
well, Steve,
12, 16, 20, if you run again, 24.
That's right. So, I love the Public Service Commission, and the reason I think it's challenging is because at our office, it's the Alabama Public Service Commission. And most people have no idea what we do there, Steve, but they believe that there's somebody there that will serve them. And so it doesn't matter if they want their garbage picked up, or if they have a problem with their cable TV, which we don't regulate, or if they have a problem, it's a veteran that needs to find a solution to their problem. It doesn't matter. They call the Public Service Commission, and I have the best staff. Debbie Williams works for me.
We got Debbie with us today.
She is, and Debbie can handle every problem in state government. She started with Governor Guy Hunt, and she knows state government, and she always puts everybody in the contact with the proper person. And so it makes working at the PSC a lot of fun.
She's been with you the whole time, hasn't she?
She has. We started together.
In 2012?
Well, yes, we did.
But first time you elected.
We started together actually a long time before that. I was in the governor's administration, and the governor hired her and said, she's going to go in your office. And I got to know her, and if you know Debbie, you love her.
Were you in Hunt's administration?
No, sir. I was in D.C. then.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
I was in the legislature when Hunt was governor, and I liked him a lot. I got along real well. I was one of his floor leaders. Because at that time, it wasn't a Republican majority, but anyway, he took a page from George Wallace. Wallace would have us out to the governor's mansion, us in the legislature, every night. I remember my first year, I told somebody, I said, I think I've had dinner with Governor Wallace as many times as I had my family, during my first, because he would cultivate legislators. You've got to do that, and that's when governors are successful, if they cultivate a relationship with legislatures.
He was good with people.
He was.
He was a people person, and he loved to help people, and he loved to find solutions. And
he got some good staff people.
It's a shame that he didn't make it all the way to the White House.
He was a good guy. Twinkle, so you've been on the Public Service Commission. Tell everybody what all y'all do over there. By the way, y'all have had a change in people. It's been real quiet, but Chip Beaker left for health reasons, and his son's over there.
That's right. The Governor Ivey, appointed Chris Beaker, Chip Beaker's son, and we've had one commission meeting with Chris on the bench, and we'll have another one soon. But it looks like he's, as they say it, a chip off the old block. Chip. So
Twinkle, back to you though. You 12, 16, 20, and 24.
Right.
So you've run 4 4-year terms. You began your fourth 4-year term as president of the commission. Right. You run in presidential years.
That's correct.
The other 2 commissioners run in gubernatorial years.
That's correct.
Now,
that's right.
So they'll be on the ballot next year.
That's right. That's right.
Will Beaker run for election, you think? Because he said he's going to run? Or
you're going to need to have him on the show and find out.
And Jeremy, I don't ever hear from Jeremy much anymore.
Well,
he's going to need to have Jeremy back on the show. I assume he's going to run for re-election.
I don't know. I don't know, but you need to have him on and find out.
I know. Ask him. Because it'll be a big year, and it's going to start right away.
Right away, you got it. At the commission, we've had a lot of issues, and you ask, what do we do at the commission? We find solutions for people no matter what their problems are and find the right place for them to talk, but we are a legislative creation. Even though we are elected statewide, the legislature created, in the beginning, the Railway Commission in the 1800s. Every state had one. And slowly, the legislature started giving the commission more responsibility. And with that responsibility, in the 30s, they changed the name to the Alabama Public Service Commission. So what we do does not necessarily fit in a nice little neat package. Instead, it's all over the place. We do everything from gas pipeline safety, which is a federal program. We do railroad inspections for track and large equipment. We regulate utility companies like Alabama Power, Spire Gas, Mobile or Gulf Gas, still Spire, but Spire Gulf. We also regulate water and wastewater. So there are a lot of different things we do there. We do real-time insurance for 18-wheelers. We do moving companies. Recently, Uber and Lyft are ride-sharing companies.
Y'all regulate those,
Yes. So
the legislature put that under y'all's bailiwick.
Yes. And so it's a very varied responsibility, but we have a great team at the commission, and they're doing a fantastic job.
Do y'all have a lot of demand for regulation on Uber and Lyft? Is that taking much time?
Well, we have people working on it, making sure everything's done correctly. But the reality is, the reason the legislature put it under the Public Service Commission is it needed to have a place in state government, because at the time, each individual municipality was regulating. And so if you had, let's say, a college student that maybe was in Tuscaloosa and needed to get to Birmingham, they were regulated in Tuscaloosa, then they had to be regulated in Birmingham, but when they were in between, no one was regulating.
Yeah.
And so a lot of states were then creating a place for regulation under a different entity in the state. And here in our state, legislators decided to put it under the Public Service Commission. But you want to make sure that the companies are checking that the cars are safe, they're not too old, to make sure the drivers are having background checks. You want to make sure that the car is identified as properly regulated, and for the safety of consumers.
Well,
but
yeah.
Yes.
You don't want to call them and get in a bad situation. But
Right.
Twinkle, as you know, I studied political history somewhat, and do you know there's been more governors come out of the presidency of the Public Service Commission, going back when it was also the Railroad Commission, than Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General. You know, our only governor in Pike County, Charles Henderson, was president of the Public Service Commission.
Right, there's quite
That's
a
how
few on that wall.
it was called the Railroad Commission.
That's right.
I think the one who was sandwiched in between Big Jim's term, Gordon Persons.
That's right.
He came from the Public Service
Yes.
Commission. And it was called, but when Charles Henderson was governor, it was the Railroad Commission.
Now, when I was first elected, Lucy Baxley was president. And, she was the Democrat nominee for governor.
That's right.
But obviously didn't make it to the governorship, but she was lieutenant governor. And she was in recent memory on the commission. But there's a wall of history at the commission of all the commissioners dating back to the 1800s.
And a lot of governors on there. Yeah.
A lot of governors, yes, sir.
Twinkle, we've only got about 5 minutes left. Let's talk about the energy issue, because you being a 13-year veteran of being president of Alabama's Public Service Commission, I'm sure you are looked upon for leadership among the National Public Service Commission things. What's going on nationally? It's almost like the national politics. Our southern states and public service commissioners like you are probably pretty conservative on energy issues,
Yes.
whereas I bet the California folks are like worlds apart, aren't they?
Worlds apart, yes. I always say this Green New Deal, which is the liberals' religion, is sad. You know, you almost look at them and you think it's sad that they have come to that point in life. But what they want to do is get rid of all fossil fuels. And when I first got to the commission, they were fighting against coal. They wanted to do away with coal. So as you know, many coal-fired units were turned over to natural gas-fired units. Well, now they're fighting against all fossil fuels. Well, if you were to take away all fossil fuels, we'd be in the dark. There's a place for solar in some areas. There's a place for wind, not here in Alabama. But these alternative forms are fine as part of the full mix, but you have got to have fossil fuels. And one of the things, policy out of Washington matters. And I always, when I speak to groups, I say, do you know what the price of a barrel of oil is today? And, it's hovering somewhere in the ballpark now of right around $70 to $75 a barrel. Well, 4 years ago, a barrel of oil was trading for $42. And with you have a 75% increase in oil, and at one point over the last 3 years, it went as high as $123 a barrel. When you've got oil really at 75 to 120% increase, you've got a real change in the economy overall, because what people don't realize, they don't think about what does a barrel of oil cost. But when you get up in the morning and you use soap, byproduct of oil, you put contacts in your eyes, that plastic, a byproduct of oil. Maybe the glasses are plastic, byproduct of oil. You go into the kitchen, you pour yourself a bowl of cereal, that wheat or corn, the fertilizer, byproduct of oil. You can keep going on and on. Had to get to market. First of all, the tractors and the 18-wheelers, they use oil. And then you can just keep going. But the reality is the grocery store has to keep things really cool, and it takes a lot of electricity. that electricity, there's a lot of oil and oil byproducts to produce that electricity. And so, you know, everywhere across the board, when you increase the price of oil through bad policy coming out of Washington, and I've told this story many times, but they got rid of the Keystone Pipeline on the first day. Thank goodness. What Donald Trump wants to do is to get the oil flowing again, drill, baby, drill, use fossil fuels. He believes in fracking for the natural gas. We've got to have that because that will keep our economy roaring. But when they got rid of that Keystone Pipeline, we still get that 850,000 barrels of oil a day, but we get it via train and trucks. Now, how many train cars do you think it takes daily? Remember, 1,125 to take it down from Canada down to the refineries, and 1,125 to get it back up there to pick up the next load. 2,250 a day.
Oh my God.
Almost 5,000 truckloads a day. Now, how is that more environmentally friendly? Look, I love trains, I love trucks. We regulate both, and we actually inspect pipelines and regulate pipelines. I know a little bit about all three, but I can promise you the most economically efficient and the cleanest way to get it down is a pipeline. But the administration, the Biden administration, just got rid of it all on day one. That's why Washington is so important for what we do. We've got to have conservatives. We've got to have a Senate. We've got to have people like Katie Britt and Tommy Tuberville that are doing a fantastic job at understanding how important these energy issues are.
I agree with you 100%. Twinkle, we're so fortunate to have a good, strong, conservative leader in the Public Service Commission, but our time's up. But I'm glad we touched on that energy thing because I'm sure a lot of the other public service commissions in the country leaned on you for advice, and you have more influence than just here in Alabama. Folks, our guest tonight has been Twinkle Cavanaugh, Twinkle Andrews Cavanaugh. She's lost at Andrews a little bit now, just goes by her married name, Cavanaugh, most of the time now. Or she was Andrews' maiden name, but she's one of the top elected officials in the state and one of the most honest and trustworthy and charismatic person in the state government, and we appreciate Twinkle taking time to be with us, and thank you viewers for watching. Hope you tune again next week for Alabama Politics. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
This has been Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, a production of Troy University Television. Opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Troy University, its administration, faculty, staff, or students.